This is Grandmare's story, and it begins on page 72. I was a very popular girl when I was young, Julian, said Grandmare. I had many friends. I had pretty clothes. As you can see, I have always liked pretty clothes. She waved her hands down her sides to make sure I noticed her dress. She smiled. I was a frivolous girl, she continued. Spoiled. When the Germans came to France, I hardly took any notice. I knew that some Jewish families in my village were moving away, but my family was so cosmopolitan. My parents were intellectual atheists. We didn't even go to synagogue. She paused here and asked me to bring her a wine glass, which I did. She served herself a glass, and as she always did, offered me some too. And as I always did, I said, non merci. Like I said, Mom would go ballistic if she knew the stuff Grandmère did sometimes. There was a boy in my school called, well, they called him Torteau, she continued. How do you say the word? Crippled? Is that how you say it? I don't think people use that word anymore, Grandmère, I said. It's not exactly politically correct, if you know what I mean. She flicked her hand at me. Americans are always coming up with new words we can't say anymore, she said. Oh well. Torteau's legs were deformed from the polio. He needed 2 canes to walk with, and his back was all twisted. I think that's why he was called Torteau. Crab. He always walked sideways like a crab. I know it sounds very harsh. Children were meaner in those days. I thought how I had called August the freak behind his back, but at least I never called him that to his face. Grandmère continued talking. I have to admit, at first I wasn't into telling me one of her long stories, but I was getting into this one. Torteau was a little thing, a skinny thing. None of us ever talked to him because he made us feel uncomfortable. He was so different. I never even looked at him. I was afraid of him, afraid to look at him, to talk to him, afraid he would accidentally touch me. It was easier to pretend he didn't exist. She took a sip of her wine. One morning, a man came running into our school. I knew him. Everyone did. He was a partisan. Do you know what that is? He was against the Germans. He rushed into the school and told the teachers that the Germans were coming to take all the Jewish children away. What? What is this? I could not believe what I was hearing. The teachers in the school went around to all the classes and gathered the Jewish children together. We were told to follow them into the woods. We were going to hide. Hurry, hurry, hurry. I think there may be 10 of us in all. Hurry, 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 escape. Grandmère looked at me to make sure I was listening, which of course I was. It was snowing that morning and very cold, and all I could think was, if I go into the woods, I will ruin my shoes. I was wearing these beautiful new red shoes that Papa had brought me, you see, and as I said before, I was a frivolous girl, perhaps even a little stupid. But this is what I was thinking. I did not even stop to think, well, where is Mama and Papa? If the Germans were coming for the Jewish children, had they come for the parents already? This did not occur to me. All I could think about was my beautiful shoes. So, instead of following him into the woods, I snuck away from the group and went to hide inside the bell tower of the school. There was a tiny room up there full of crates and books, and there I hid. I remember thinking I would go home in the afternoon after the Germans came and tell Mama and Papa all about it. This is how stupid I was, Julian. I nodded. I couldn't believe I had never heard this story before. And then the Germans came, she said. There was a narrow window in the tower, and I could see them perfectly. I watched them run into the woods after the children. It did not take them very long to find them. They all came back together. The Germans, the children. Grandmère paused and blinked a few times, and then she took a deep breath. The children cried. They cried as they were led away in a line. One of the teachers, Mademoiselle Perigine, went with them, even though she was not Jewish. She said she would not leave her children. No one ever saw her again, poor thing. By now, Julian, I had awakened from my stupidity. I was not thinking of my red shoes anymore. I was thinking of my friends who had been taken. I was thinking of my parents. I was waiting until this nightmare or this nighttime was over so that I could come home to them. But not all the Germans had left. Some had stayed behind along with the French police. They were searching the school. And then I realized they were looking for me. Yes, for me, and for the one or two other Jewish children who had not gone into the woods. I realized then that my friend Rachel had not been taken among the Jewish children, and she was not among those who were marched away. Nor Jacob, a boy from another village, who all the girls wanted to marry because he was so handsome. Where were they? They must have been hiding just like I was. Then I heard creaking, Julian. Up the stairs I heard footsteps, up the stairs, coming closer to me. I was so scared. I tried to make myself as small as possible behind the crate, and I hid my head beneath a blanket. Here, Grandmère covered her head with her arms as if to show me how she was hiding. And then I heard someone whisper my name, she said. It was not a man's voice. It was a child's voice. Sarah, the voice whispered. I peeked out from the blanket. Torteau? I answered, astonished. I was so surprised because in all these years I had known him, I don't think I had ever said a word to him, nor him to me, and yet there he was calling my name. They will find you here, he said. Follow me. And I did follow him, for by now I was terrified. He led me down a hallway into the chapel of the school, which I had never really been before. We went to the back of the chapel, where there was a crypt. All this was new to me, Julian. We crawled through the crypt so that the Germans would not see us through the windows, because they were still looking for us. I heard when they had found Rachel. I heard her in the courtyard as they took her away. Poor Rachel. Torteau took me down to the basement beneath the crypt. There must have been 100 steps at least. These were not easy for Torteau, as you can imagine, with his terrible limp and his 2 canes, but he hopped down the steps 2 at a time, looking behind him to make sure I was following. Finally, we arrived at a passage. It was so narrow we had to walk sideways to get through. And then we were in the sewers, Julian. Can you imagine? I knew instantly because of the smell, of course. We were knee-deep in refuse. You can imagine the smell. So much for my red shoes. We walked all night. I was so cold, Julian. Torteau was such a kind boy, though. He gave me his coat to wear. It was, to this day, the most noble act anyone has ever done for me. He was freezing, too, but he gave me his coat. I was so ashamed for the way I had treated him. Oh, Julian, I was so ashamed. She covered her mouth with her fingers and swallowed. Then she finished her glass of wine and poured herself another. The sewers led to Donneviers, a small village about 15 kilometers. Mama and Papa always avoided this town because of the smell. The sewers from Paris drained into the farmland there. We wouldn't even eat apples grown there. But it's where Torteau lived. He took me to his house, and we cleaned ourselves by the well. And then Torteau brought me to the barn behind his house. He wrapped me up in a horse blanket and told me to wait. He was going to get his parents. No, I pleaded. Please don't tell them. I was so frightened. I wondered if when they saw me they would call the Germans. I had never met them before. But Torteau left, and a few minutes later he returned with his parents. They looked at me. I must have seemed quite pathetic there, all wet and shivering. The mother, Vivian, put her arms around me to comfort me. Oh, Julian, that hug was the warmest hug I have ever felt. I cried so hard in this woman's arms because I knew I would never cry in my own mama's arms again. I just knew it in my heart, Julian. And I was right. They had taken Mama that same day, with all the other Jews in the city. My father, who had been at work, had been warned that the Germans were coming and managed to escape. He was smuggled to Switzerland, but it was too late for Mama. She was deported that day to Auschwitz. I never saw her again. My beautiful Mama. She took a deep breath here and shook her head. And I'm going to stop right there on page 77.